Hey there, I'm Joel Jamieson, 8weeksout.com and founder of the BioForce HRV system, and I'd like to welcome you back to the fourth and final video of Energy Systems 101. Now, just a quick review. Last time we talked about how the aerobic and the anaerobic systems are related. Now, we talked about the fact that anaerobic energy systems are capable of much higher rates of energy production than the aerobic side. But we talked about the fact that that comes at the cost of higher fatigue. In other words, the more you use the anaerobic systems, the faster you fatigue. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the anaerobic systems are bad or that we don't want to train them, just we need to understand their role and their overall place in terms of performance. Because again, the more we increase the anaerobic energy production, the more total power we're capable of producing, and speed and power is obviously an incredibly important part of performance of different sports. So just keeping in mind that the more power you produce, the less duration you're going to be able to produce it for. Now, we can look at the body has two different pathways it uses that we coin anaerobic, which just means without oxygen. The first is the Lactic Energy system, and this just means that energy is produced without the byproduct of lactate. And this is essentially what most people would call their creatine phosphate system, and using supplemental creatine is part of how that supplement is able to increase strength and power in certain areas by increasing the substrates that are used by the alactic or creatine phosphate system. Okay, the next one is the lactic energy system, and that is where we produce ATP, that energy molecule we talked about without oxygen, but the ultimate one of the byproducts is lactate. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this. People have thought this idea for years that this is where lactic acid gets produced and lactic acid causes fatigue. Suffice to say that's not the case. Lactic acid does not cause fatigue, and lactate itself is used as an energy substrate by the aerobic system, and it doesn't quite work that way. So there's more to the lactic system than lactic acid, and again, you do fatigue very quickly when the system is used, but it's not because of lactic acid. So that's another topic for another day, but just understand there's two main pathways the body uses anaerobically to produce energy. One is the lactic system, which is, again, most people call the creatine phosphate system, and one is the lactic system. Now, if we look at what we call substrate power, this essentially shows us how quickly the body is able to produce ATP with given substrates or materials it uses to make those ATP molecules. And here we see, of course, that phosphagen and the glycolytic system, those substrates are able to produce ATP much faster than the aerobic side, which we see as fat and carbohydrate from mitochondria. Basically, it just tells us that part of the reason that the anaerobic systems produce more power is that the components they use to produce the energy are able to be turned into ATP at a much, much higher rate, much, much faster. So again, rate is power. The faster you can do something, the more power you can generate. And the anaerobic systems are the very high horsepower systems. They just can't sustain it for very long. All right, so like the aerobic training, let's talk about some basic principles of the anaerobic side of things. First of all, the most fundamental thing, most important thing is that the intensity should always be greater than 90% of your max if your goal is to improve the anaerobic side. This is because the anaerobic side, like we talked about before, doesn't kick in until you're past the point at which you can sustain aerobic energy production. So the body does not produce anaerobic energy until it has to. So if you're not at the highest intensities, chances are, even though you're working hard, you're probably not working the anaerobic system to its capabilities, and thus it's not going to improve. So the most important thing, again, intensity drives results when it comes to anaerobic training. Now, this is also why you want to use longer rest periods when your goal is to develop maximum power. Power is maximum intensity for short periods of time, followed by longer periods of rest, and then repeat. If you're trying to squeeze out a little bit more anaerobic energy, you'd use a little bit shorter rest intervals and a little bit longer work intervals. But far too many people think they're doing anaerobic training, but they're just doing very short work period or very long work periods with very short rest periods. And as we showed you in the earlier videos, the more you do that, the more aerobic the whole thing becomes. You're defeating the purpose of the anaerobic training in the first place. So you want to use longer periods of rest, shorter periods of work, and maximum intensity. And again, the goal of anaerobic training isn't just to fatigue yourself. The goal is to improve your maximum power, your maximum force, your maximum work output. And again, the goal is not just killing yourself. The goal is improving those things, which means maximum effort, enough rest to repeat it. And that's really one of the most important principles for anaerobic training. So let's talk about how we do that by looking at some methods. All right, first would be the alactic intervals, or you call them creatine phosphate intervals, whatever you want. Now the goal here is just to beef up the power of that creatine phosphate system so that it can produce ATP a little bit faster, maybe a little bit longer. And again, since this is the most powerful, most explosive, but shortest duration anaerobic system you have to keep the work intervals very short. And by very short, 3 to 6 seconds is typically the max you're going to get out of this, and then you're going to rest anywhere from 60 to 120 seconds, or even sometimes longer, and you're going to repeat that 10 to 20 sets. Now again, the goal here is to produce as much work, as much power, as much force over those 3 to 6 seconds as possible. The goal is not to do as many of those intervals as you possibly can in a given workout, because what's going to happen is you're going to compromise the intensity by having to slow down as you fatigue. So the goal is to produce as much force, as much power for 3 to 6 seconds, and then rest as long as it takes in order to repeat that at roughly close to the same level. If you're able to sprint some distance in 3 seconds, you should rest long enough so that on the next one you're able to sprint about the same distance. If you're not even close to the same distance because you're completely fatigued, well, that tells us that the aerobic system is doing the majority of the work and you're not getting the same anaerobic benefits. So again, shorter work intervals, longer rest intervals is the absolute key to developing the anaerobic side of the equation. And again, you want to use exercises here that are designed or intended for this sort of explosive strength and power work. Exercise selection when it comes to the anaerobic side is absolutely essential. Now let's say we want to develop that lactic system we talked about here. That system is able to produce energy for a little bit longer, and so we're going to want to use periods of work between 30 to 40 seconds, followed by periods of rest of 1 to 4 minutes. And again, the same principles apply. You want to use a long enough rest interval so that you can complete another round of the work and maintain a pretty close to the same level of power, speed, strength, whatever, as you did in the last one. If you're significantly fatiguing between each and every set, you're not going to see the same benefit. So rest as much as you need to be able to repeat. I can't stress the importance of that enough. Now, when you're doing this sort of work, you want to use anywhere from 2 to 5 sets and 1 to 2 series. And what I mean by that is you'd want to use 2 to 5 sets, then you'd want to rest for 8 to 10 minutes, sometimes even longer. And now by rest, I don't mean sit there and do nothing. I mean use some sort of active rest or active recovery or do something else, and then come back to it and do another 2 to 5 sets. So in this case, the 2 to 5 sets would be considered 1 series. You want to do 1 to 2 series of those depending on what level of athlete or what level of fitness you have. If you're at a higher level, you're going to need to do more. And this is where you might do 2 to 5 sets. You might take 8 to 10 minutes and do some active recovery type work, and then come back and do another 2 to 5 sets of that lactic type work. Now again, longer rest if your goal is to develop the power of the lactic system, a little bit shorter rest if your goal is to develop the capacity of that system. So again, there's infinite methods you can come up with to develop the alactic and the lactic system, but the main principles that you need to apply are the shorter work intervals, longer rest intervals, and make sure that you can repeat over and over again at relatively the same level. The goal is not just fatigue. The goal is to improve anaerobic power, and that only comes when you repeat that high level power through high intensity over and over again. All right, so just to give you a quick summary, anaerobic training is about intensity. It's not about fatigue. And when you have to decrease that intensity because you're doing too much in a short period of time, you get less than optimal results. Okay? High intensity training over and over again is going to lead to fatigue if you do it too often. So the anaerobic side of the system really should not be trained more than 2 to 3 times a week if your goal is to see continued improvements. Now, the reason people train more often than that is obviously in the short run you may see bigger returns, but that's the reason people plateau, that's the reason people get injured and overtrained. It's because they're trying to do too much in a short period of time. So again, general rule of thumb, very few people can sustain more than 3 days a week of high intensity training for any given time without ultimately plateauing, overtraining, and then getting injured and having other bad things happen. So 2 to 3 times a week is about all you're going to want to do when it comes to this anaerobic type training. Now again, many different methods can be used as long as the basic principles we've talked about in this section are followed. All right, so to wrap things up, let's talk about some additional resources. Of course, you can find more information, more articles, and more courses on my website, 8weeksout.com. We have bioforceproject.com, where you can find more video courses across a broad range of topics. And of course, you can find me on Facebook. Just look up Joel Jamieson on Facebook and go ahead and add me and feel free to ask if you have any questions. So thanks again for watching. I hope you got a lot out of the course, and we'll see you again soon.